Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Jakob Kjellman and I'm a part of the Business Policy Department here at Stockholm Chamber of Commerce. For those of you who don't know, I can briefly just mention that the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce is a business organization in Stockholm, Sweden, representing around 1,500 companies from different sectors in the Stockholm region. This webinar is a joint production of Stockholm Chamber of Commerce and Swedish Chambers International. The global business landscape is constantly changing and new so-called trade hegemonies are rapidly taking form. At the same time, we see terms as protectionism, friendshoring and securitization being used diligently by leading politicians. How does a changing geopolitical landscape affect international trade, and has free trade and interdependence taken a permanent, unrecoverable hit? These are the reason why we have chosen the topic, the changing global business landscape, for this webinar. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Swedish Chambers International and my colleague and co-host, Louise Li Hultberg.
So hello everyone, my name is Louise Li Hultberg and I am a trainee at the Swedish Chambers International, which is a member organization consisting of 32 Swedish Chambers of Commerces all around the world. Using cross-chamber events, our aim is to increase knowledge sharing across borders, and in uncertain times like this, collaboration is truly key. International trade used to only concern profit and efficiency, but today it must also consider geopolitical tensions. There is a new business landscape now that all actors, especially those in international trades, must learn how to navigate in. Well, enough about us. Let me briefly introduce the structure for today. We will first listen to a keynote speaker, and for the second half, there will be a panel discussions with some relevant actors. Mikael Wigell is a research director at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and a professor in international political economy. His work on great power politics and geoeconomics has been published in International Affairs, the European Commission, and World Development. The floor is yours, Mikael.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Jakob, for that introduction. And thanks for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. What I really would like to do is to set the scene with the big picture. So what's really taking place in the international system at large, and how that affects our global business landscape right now. And this is, of course, a story of increasing strategic competition in the international system, with heavy repercussions on the global business landscape. And I think the first thing that we really need to take on board is that the logic of global economic relations is really changing. We're moving from a logic that was very much based on market economics and liberalism. We're moving to something else, which is different from that. And that means, and we see it at least in two things, right? First is that we're having a completely different view of interdependence than used to be the case. So policymakers used to see interdependence, economic interdependence, in a very positive light. That's out of the window now, almost. Policymakers see risks and vulnerabilities in economic interdependencies. And that's why we have a completely changing economic policymaking these days, with much more heavy emphasis on autonomy, in improving, strengthening our economic autonomy. In the EU, in the US, in China, we see it all around the international system. The second is, of course, that then also the view of economic efficiency is changing. There used to be heavy emphasis on economic policymaking that was strengthening economic and market efficiency. Now there's much more emphasis on economic resilience, in strengthening economic resilience, and that takes completely different economic instruments and different policies. So there's a strong emphasis these days in the EU, but all around on, for instance, de-risking. There's a lot of talk about how to de-risk from our heavy dependencies on China, for instance, to wean ourselves off those economic dependencies of China. And we have a heavy emphasis on economic security these days, which didn't used to be the case. Now economic security is something that has been brought into our agenda of national security, or national security doctrines. There's a lot of talk about economic security these days. So how to make sense of this, how to make sense of this changing logic of global economic relations? Now, as I already alluded to before, I think liberalist market economics are really quite poor guides to the transformation underway, because we're moving away from those paradigms in economic policymaking. And we need a new analytical framework to understand these heavy transformations. And I think geoeconomics is really the new paradigm for understanding what's happening in the international system and in economic policymaking. We see a rise of geoeconomics in the international system. And with geoeconomics, we really mean the way major states are using economics and economic policymaking to advance very strategic, very political aims and goals. So we can think of the US, for instance, using its heavy use of sanctions these days. Economic sanctions have become centerpiece almost of US foreign and security policymaking. Or we can think of China using investments, loans, big infrastructure projects to make other countries dependent on China. And through that, China has gotten a lot of political influence over these countries, and also in the international system at large. So China has really been basing its rise to global powerhood basis of using economic instruments, not traditional old-style geopolitical instruments, which are more kind of military instruments. There's actually, for all the talk about the return of geopolitics in the international system, that's really a side story. It's really Russia, of the major actors in the international system. It's really only Russia that has returned to old-style geopolitics, meaning military-based politics. Most of the other actors, big actors in the national system, are using economics and economic instruments to further their strategic goals. So what we're seeing at the same time is that economics and security policy making that used to be very different zones of policy making, they're becoming enmeshed. So more and more economic policy making is being made with security interests in mind, and the other way around. A lot of security policy is being made through economic means and using economic instruments. And this is a completely changed way of doing power politics that we see now in the international system. And that's, of course, affecting heavily our or the norms and rules that governs our international economy. That's why all the organizations such as the World Trade Organization is not functioning very well at the time being. It's almost in a frozen state because we see this rise of geoeconomics, which really challenges all the old rules that we had for our economy. So what I'll be doing here is really to look at what I would say are the three most important trends that go with this rise of geoeconomics. And I will speak about the weaponization of the economy, the securitization of the economy, and the balkanization of the economy. So let's start with what I call the weaponization of the economy. So economic policy is really seen by the major actors in the system as a strategic weapon these days. And that's why we have all new economic sanctions being taken into play these days. We have these financial sanctions very much used by the United States and Europe, of course, but increasingly and interestingly, we also see China, signs of China starting to use more economic sanctions as well, and those are in that case trade sanctions, because China is the centerpiece in the world trade economy. It can use trade sanctions very effectively, and we see more signs of that. Before, China didn't use so much sanctions, but now there are signs of that. China is actually putting a lot of emphasis in develop a new framework for the use of sanctions. And we have sanctions innovation taking place very much. We have sanctions that can be targeted very effectively against companies, against individuals. So more sanctions used than ever in world history today. We also see companies being used for espionage. This is also something which is an increasing part of this weaponization trend going on. And we see the purposeful use of corruption. So the purposeful use by countries trying to corrupt economic stakeholders, economic actors in other countries, and through that gain political influence and economic influence. So corporate vulnerability to sanctions, corruptions, and espionage are clearly increasing. And that we have a bit of a risk for a sanction spiral in the international system these days. This will very much depend on how great power relations will move from here on. If we see worsening relations between the US and China, we will have more sanctions. We will have US putting more sanctions against China, and China responding with counter sanctions. So that's something to look after. The second trend, which is a direct consequence of the weaponization trend, is the what I call the securitization of the world economy. So the security sensitiveness is increasing in economic policy making, and that's why we have a lot of new economic instruments taking into play, because countries need to protect their economies from the weaponization of the economy. So we have investment screening, both inbound, outbound. We see more and more export controls and restrictions. We have new science and technology cooperation restrictions being placed. So companies, for instance, or universities are not free anymore to cooperate with any actor in the international system that they would like. We have restrictions on those cooperations, but for instance, with Chinese actors these days. We have data localization regulations, critical infrastructure protection regulations, reshoring subsidies, of course, we've seen quite a lot, and new industrial policy. We can think of the big packages that the US, for instance, has been putting into place now, the IRA package with heavy subsidies for green technology. We have the CHIPS Act with heavy subsidies for chips making. So broader state intervention in very strategic sectors of the economy. Again, this trend is heavily contingent on how great power relations will move in the future. If we have worsening relations, we will have more securitization. If relations get better, less securitization. The last trend I'd like to highlight here is what I call the balkanization of the global economy. So with this, I mean the disintegration of global economic networks into smaller ecosystems. So we see decoupling taking place in important global value and supply chains, and we've seen that for some time already, especially when it comes to high technology. And this, of course, is a consequence very much of US sanctions and US policies to reshore away from China, from Chinese-controlled value and supply chains. We also see a lot of competition over technical standards and norms. So that I can use my mobile phone anywhere, almost anywhere in the world, or my credit card almost anywhere in the world, has to do with market actors having agreed on a set of common technical standards. All new technology needs to be standardized. Now, that was relatively easy before. Market actors could agree on those standards when new technologies were taken out on the market. Now, however, the situation has changed. We see a lot of competition in these international standard-setting regimes, with the Chinese state having become very active in those standard-setting regimes, and US and Europe responding to that activity very much. So countries now want to set their own standards because who controls standards will, of course, be in a very, very powerful position. So the risk is that standards will disintegrate, and if we companies coming up with new technology would then have reduced market access, or will need to come up with different sets of technology for the different sort of regions in that sense, which will of course be very costly. Do we see deglobalization right now? Well, trade and investment patterns have certainly turned a bit downwards right now. Data flows still growing heavily, global data flows. Whether this trend will accelerate or decelerate will depend on great power relations again. Now, what I really want to highlight here is that because of these trends and because of the rise of geoeconomics, our economic model is actually changing. We're moving from a market capitalist model to what I would call a strategic capitalist model. So I've here depicted sort of three economic models. Market capitalism is our traditional economic model where the state intervenes in a very limited fashion in the economy. When it does so for economic reasons, to correct a market failure, to create more market efficiency into the economy. That's a model which is becoming weaker. That does not mean that we're necessarily moving into a Chinese model, a model that we could call state capitalism. State capitalism, the Chinese model, is a model where the state intervenes very heavily in the economy, overboard in almost all sectors of the economy. And it does so often for political reasons, not only economic reasons, but political reasons in order to control market actors. It doesn't want the market actors to become too independent. So in that model, state-corporate relations are very close. Now in the West, I think what we're seeing is a movement to indeed what I call strategic capitalism, where the state intervenes in the economy in a very selective way, quite heavily in strategic sectors of the economy, whereas other sectors of the economy are left to laissez-faire. And it does so for security reasons, because security interests have become so important for the strategic competition in the whole international system as such. So state-corporate relations will be very close in some strategic sectors, not so close in others. Now, okay, what will the impact be of all these big trends on the international business landscape? What I will do here now is to look a bit on the impact on corporate supply chains. So on market access, on technology development and transfer, on the sourcing of raw material, access to talent, supply chain reorganizations. These are all important elements for any international business when it comes to how to manage supply chains. The effects will indeed be quite far-reaching of these trends and the sort of the movement in the economic model. Let's start with market access. So we will have no-go markets limiting business development perspectives. In some respect, in some sectors, even China has already become a no-go market in certain respect. And Russia, of course, is certainly a no-go market these days. We might see more of those no-go markets if we have more sort of balkanization in the economy and the splintering of economic areas. Risk of stranded assets. We've already seen that, of course, in Russia, with all our assets stranded there. Increasingly, we might be seeing that in China and some other areas as well. Crowding out effect due to made-in policies. We can think of the US IRA package, where a certain amount of production will need to have taken place in the US for companies to be eligible for subsidies. The next one, technology development transfer. Loss of critical technology partners is, of course, a risk. Herein, we already are seeing that in companies that are heavily exposed to Chinese technology production or certain supply chains that go back to China. We can't do certain work with certain technology partners in China anymore, certainly not with Russia anymore either. The risk of being caught in digital and data traps, so-called digital and data traps. Data can't be taken out from certain areas, certain countries. We will probably see more of that going forward when we have more data localization requirements. Outbound investment screening to limit technology cooperation with third parties, increasing risk as well when we're talking about technology development transfer. Then the third big problem, big challenge these days, due to this sort of rise of geoeconomics, is the sourcing of raw materials. We've already seen significant price fluctuations when it comes to raw material markets, oil, gas, wheat, even fertilizers, things like that. We have run a big risk of loss of access to critical raw materials going forward. We can, of course, for example, think of Chinese control of very critical minerals, very critical metals that we need for our green energy transition. If China chooses to put export restrictions on those very strategic raw materials, that's a big problem for European green transition, of course. And with all the de-risking, the friendshoring, the new protectionism, the balkanization, we of course have a risk of increasing dependence on just a few suppliers, because certain suppliers are no-go. We can't use them. Fourth, access to talents. We run the risk of a loss of access to critical expertise, especially when it comes to the problematic relations with China. There's a lot of critical expertise that is Chinese that we've been using all around in the West before, and there's a risk that we can't do that going forward. Growing risk of espionage, I already touched upon that, and risk of sea-level sort of geoeconomic decapitation due to these export license requirements. We can't use certain personnel anymore going forward because of export license requirements. Lastly, supply chain reorganization. So heavy state intervention in supply chains, risk, of course, offsetting market signals. and friendshoring, ally shoring policies risk undermining diversification, of course. And in general, because of these new requirements and the de-risking and the economic security requirements being taken into play more and more, corporate capacities risk becoming quite overstretched, or quite stretched at least, because of these new policies. So consequences for corporate strategies of these new developments taking place are quite far-reaching, and corporate strategies will need to think through very carefully how to go about and how to reorganize perhaps their strategies to some extent. Supply chain management is one thing, of course, which is no longer a purely corporate task, in fact, because governments are eyeing for de-risking economic security and therefore putting a lot of new requirements on companies when it comes to supply chain management. Foreign definitions of critical industries and technologies. So a lot of industries and technologies are defined as critical, and that will, of course, increasingly shape and limit companies' strategic leeway. This will, of course, companies will need to think through their geoeconomic risk appetite. I've been here, of course, talking a lot now about risks, but the other side of the risk coin is, of course, that there are also rewards. There are also opportunities for many companies in these new developments. It's not only, it's not entirely negative. There are positive aspects for some companies, and depending on how much risk one is willing to take, there might be a lot of rewards to be reaped out of these developments as well. And companies really will need to think through their risk appetite and invest in corporate regulatory agility. That's clear that there will be a lot of new regulations, and one need to be very agile in navigating this sort of new landscape of these geoeconomic risks that I've been talking about. And lastly, corporate will need to refocus, rebrand their risk assessments. Traditional business risk assessment do not include these geoeconomic risks that I've been talking about here. They usually only include sort of market risks and those sort of things. They will need to invoke these new sort of risks into their risk assessments, into their risk scenarios as well. And that will take some new thinking through that. So that was sort of the scene setting, big picture that was supposed to give a sort of a basis for our discussion here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mikael. Summarizing this complex situation in less than 30 minutes is definitely not an easy task. So let us now move into the next session, which is a panel discussion. And I'm now opening up the floor to Jonas Lindström, Daniela Elvik-Hasmer, and Sara Larsson. Each of them are general managers at the Swedish Chambers of Commerce in 3 key markets. We have Brazil, China, and India. They're also members of the board at the Swedish Chambers International Network. So Jakob, take it away with the first question for our experts.
Yes. Thank you, Louise. My first question goes out to Mikael. In the marketing of this webinar, a quote from the well-renowned Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises has been used. The quote says that the philosophy of protectionism is the philosophy of war, suggesting that trade and open economies are vital for both freedom and peace. With that quote in mind, and considering that the global business landscape is changing, how worried do we have to be about this change in the landscape from a security policy point of view?
I would partly agree with Ludwig von Mises' quote. An open economy usually seems to go together with liberal democracy, so at least for freedom, an open economy seems important. It is sort of part of the liberal democratic infrastructure. And in that sense, current trends are worrying also from the perspective of our open societies and functioning of our democracy. When it comes to peace, it's really a bit more tricky, I think, than the quote gives at hand. Yes, trade linkages raise the threshold of going to war with each other because the fear that one would end up hurting oneself in the process, sort of. But we've seen many periods in history when wars have actually started, even in a situation of large economic interdependencies. Think of the outbreak of the First World War, which was certainly a period of almost unprecedented economic interdependence and globalization. But one thing is certainly different from von Mises' times, or the times when he was writing, and that's nuclear weapons. At the time of von Mises, there weren't any nuclear arms around. Now there is. And that very much raises the threshold of major states going to war with each other. So even though we don't like nuclear weapons very much, they certainly a brake on large-scale warfare in our times. So, we should be a bit worried, of course. Rising protectionism is not a good thing for the economy as such. It's not a good thing from the international systemic perspective. But on the other hand, there are other things that also will play into the situation picture very much.
And now looking at the Swedish Chambers International, how have you perceived that your members are dealing with this new business landscape? Have they met more challenges or perhaps even more opportunities? Let's start with the fast-growing market of India and Sara.
Thank you, Louise. Well, you said the fast-growing market of India, and that's very true, isn't it? That India is the country that is growing at a very high pace, as it is now, 7% GDP growth last year, due to very high, driven by domestic demand, public infrastructure investments, and also strengthening financial sector. And India is projected to be the world's third largest economy by 2030. So from that perspective alone, India is definitely a country of opportunities at this stage. And not only from its growth economically, but also look at the population. You have the youngest population in the world here, and also the entrepreneurship and innovation-driven business that you have here. So I would say many eyes are turned to India today, and rightly so. And I want to answer this question a little bit with background in our business climate survey that we conduct amongst the Swedish companies in India on a yearly basis. And we know that companies consider and look to India as becoming more and more competitive, relatively global value chains. In 2021, 30% of the companies thought that India was competitive. This time we measured this year, they say 40% say India is very competitive. And the key factors for that is human capital. The demographic dividend that India has, that is such an opportunity with over 2 million STEM graduates per year. 65% of the population is below 35. Second reason is geographical location. The companies reach, of course, growing and important markets easily from India, and its location is very strategic. And the third one, cost competitiveness, of course, of supply chains. But so if we consider the perspective that we're discussing today, challenges and opportunities in the four value chains, the supply and global value chains, I think it's important to notice or also take note of that 52% of the companies, the Swedish companies in India today, state that India has become much more important in their strategic sourcing plan in the last couple of years. And the reason why they say this is because, of course, of the market, the cost efficiency, but also geopolitical reasons. So we see that companies are looking to localize more production, localize the business into India. And they are also decoupling a bit from our neighbor in the east. And we also hear from the companies the way they're thinking is saying, we make in China for China. Let's make in India for India. And with that, of course, when you move comes challenges. We see the supply chains are affected, impacted, that some supply chains are being cut off because of some of the what's happening around the world. And so there is a challenge for companies to rebuild. Where do you find new suppliers? How do you transfer competence? What is the availability of technology and the quality that you need? But that's something that you also need time to work on, and that's something that I think companies in India are also used to doing, to establish and grow. And we see that happening more and more on the stage here. So that's the picture from India.
Thank you so much, Sara. And that was actually a great segue to my next question. So moving on to China, as we heard, headlines are flying about decoupling and de-risking. But how is it actually going for Swedish companies there? Is that the full picture of it, or do you have some new perspectives to share?
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I do. So what I can say here from a China perspective is that the media headlines that are given outside of China concerning the business landscape here on the grounds are not always in parity, actually, with how the reality really looks like on the market. One of the reasons, of course, main reason is due to the fact that most journalists who talk about China are actually not here themselves on the ground for different reasons, as we know. This can definitely result in a very lost business opportunities for Swedish companies in the market. China is leading in so many sectors, so it's important for the companies to follow this development of China. And also something we always call China speed. So China market is defined by speed in both development and innovation, and something that foreign companies miss out on if they're not investing or being present here actually on the Chinese market. We shouldn't forget that the size of the Chinese market is the second largest economy in the world, and that, of course, in itself represents many opportunities. So China has gone through some very challenging times, as we know, especially during COVID, zero COVID policy, that actually increased the information gap between the headquarters and the subsidiaries here in China, due mainly, of course, to the travel restrictions. And so the understanding of the Chinese market has actually decreased significantly. And this poses true challenges for the subsidiaries in the market. And although we do start to see some delegations coming, actually none less than Jacob Wallenberg came to China 1 month ago and also came with a very positive message on the China market. So we have also seen a slowed economy as another issue lately. 2022 was a very challenging year here in China. First half of 2023, also an economic slowdown. But actually, we can now see this is changing, and the economic growth is again picking up in China with a GDP growth of 5% that is actually predicted for 2023. So overall, I want to say the companies here in China are keeping a positive attitude to the Chinese market and the strategic importance of the Chinese market. And several are actually even increasing their focus and investments here. But of course, there are also companies that are halting their investments due to geopolitical tensions, as mentioned by Michael as well, and making them a little bit more conservative. We can also see that to a certain degree that a sane alteration of supply chains have taken place as well. But most MNCs are in for the long term in the Chinese market and will therefore not make decisions to leave the market during downturns as those just stated, and they instead choose to weather these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for sharing those perspectives. It's definitely a key contradiction to keep in mind, to always have the full picture. And lastly, moving into Brazil, have you perceived any changes in recent times relating to the changing business landscape, Jonas?
Okay, thank you, Louise. First of all, what a fascinating presentation by Mikael. Challenging and interesting times indeed. The saying, hope and work for the best, but plan for the worst. I guess it's more pertinent than ever, right? So here in Brazil, we also conducted the business climate survey that Sara mentioned. And we actually included a question in this year's survey about increased local production and nearshoring. And of those 50 Swedish companies that replied, actually 28% said that it's not the reality in Brazil yet. However, 12% said that they have had increased local capacity, and 14% said that they have found new business selling to clients locally. And this survey was conducted in March, April this year, so we look forward to see any changes for next year. And in the current energy crisis, something that is very high up on the agenda, on the company's agendas, is decarbonization and getting less dependent on fossil fuels, of course. So green logistics is something we see here, an increasing interest for electrified vehicles for the fleets. And new alternatives of electric vehicles and fossil-free fuels have been introduced by the automotive industry here in Brazil, also by Swedish actors. Mining is another sector we see where some interesting movements with companies searching for new ways to electrify their logistic operations, but also to make the whole mining ecosystem more sustainable. And our members, of course, as in China and India, are very aware of the current challenges and turbulences, not only here in Brazil, but globally. And there are frequent meetings to discuss new business strategies. However, the Brazilian market has always been up and down. So I think that Brazilian business leaders are usually very agile and open for quick changes. And regarding increased costs for the companies here, they do say that, yes, they have extra costs now to maintain the same quality and punctuality in the supply of their products and services. And another increased cost we hear from the companies is about cybersecurity. Since they noticed there are more and more threats, and they are working to be better prepared. Short introduction from Brazil.
Thank you so much. Let's go back to Sara. You've already touched on the subject of the market in India and the changing business landscape in the country. And India is becoming a very business-friendly landscape. For instance, the Swedish company Saab recently landed a 100% foreign direct investment for a manufacturing facility in India. And as a general manager of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce in India and an expert on the subject, what can Swedish companies expect from India for the coming years?
Thanks, Jacob. I think after many years in India, I think that India has always been business friendly. Everything is relative. And we need to remember the Swedish company have been established here for a very long time. We usually refer to Ericsson that came in 120 years back as being one of the first. And SKF celebrates 100 years in India this year. And they were followed by companies like Sandvik, Alfa Laval, Atlas Copco, and so forth, already in the 50s and 60s, setting up manufacturing in India. And these companies have all thrived. And in the last decade alone, we've seen over 110 Swedish companies entering India and setting up business here. And that takes the count in total to about 260 Swedish companies present in the country now. What we've seen during these last 10 of the decade behind us is that the pace of policy modernization, digitalization, and removing of red tape has increased. And the regulatory framework around business has become clearer. Also that the contact with authorities are more frequent. And you have to work with the authorities if you work in India on different levels, both central, on state, and on local level. And the Indian government has established support organizations like Invest India, that is under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, that supports new investors and also now taking on more questions when it comes to trade and resolve issues in the trade flow. However, as a company here, you have to learn how to navigate the landscape and how to work around and work with different stakeholders in different situations you come in here. And so I come back to that. I think when you say business friendly is relative, it's how flexible you are and how everything is kind of how you work with the difficulties ahead of you. If I look, for example, get back to the business climate survey this year, when we asked over 240 companies, Swedish companies in India, how they perceive the business climate, 86% say it's favorable and very favorable even. And of course, as we already mentioned, the growth of the market is the main driver of that. But also the companies see that they can build a sustainable and long-term business in India. Looking at India, though, from another perspective is what is the drivers here? Well, India right now is driving very strongly on this, what we call self-reliant India. They want to make India self-reliant in terms of economy, infrastructure, system, demography, and demand. And this means that they are putting in place different programs to drive manufacturing, especially. They really want to build up a strong manufacturing base in India under the program Make in India. They've given, and they are giving, a lot of incentives to companies that want to set up in India. And they, of course, they want to, this is to drive the economy, but also for job creation, because it's very important for India to find job for the young population that is here and are looking for a job for the future. And I think this is an area where we have a bit of a question mark going forward for companies, because we see that India is driving to strong on the localization, both to localize your supply chains relatively quickly, but also putting in place local standards and quality control orders that are being rolled out and don't necessarily match with the global ones. So this is a risk, well, not a risk, it's a challenge for companies when you want India to be part of your global value chain. But how do you manage this with maybe local standards that are specific for India, so they can break the global value chain link? But otherwise, I think we will see from a regulatory perspective, I think companies can expect a continuation of the maturing and streamlining of processes, and digitalization is happening super quickly here, of course, and also financial transactions, for example, where we moved over to digital transactions in 5 years' time. And now I think half of the transactions around the world, financial transactions, are happening in India as it is. I think, and I hope, that we will see also more companies forming innovative or innovation partnerships in India. Companies are already today looking towards India when it comes to R&D, but maybe more towards the end of R&D in terms of product and solution development and adaptation, and maybe not so much the core research yet. But the talent is here. There's a lot of good talent. And so is also the need for solutions in this environment, in this country, and especially when it comes to environmental sustainability, looking at the growth of India also from a people perspective. And I think as well, we need to we should keep an eye on the fact that India and EU at the moment are negotiating a free trade agreement as we speak. It's not closed. It's not close to being closed or signed yet, but conversations are going on at a high pace. And I think that will definitely strengthen further the relationship between EU and India and the trade relations.
Thank you so much, Sara. And as mentioned, there are two sides to every coin, or risk coin, as you called it, Mikael. And there are growing economies navigating in between these two increasingly clear blocks. One can refer to them as connector economies. And Brazil has been lifted as one of such candidates. But what do you think? Do you think that the infrastructure is ready to take on a larger role in the global economy?
Short answer, not yet, but working on it and working fast. And first, I think it's important to remember that Brazil really can't afford picking a side in these international conflicts. The new government that took office in January has sent clear signs. President Lula started traveling to Buenos Aires, a big Latin America meeting, his first trip, going from there to United States, meeting with Biden, going to China, signing agreements with China, going to Europe, to continue discussions with more traditional partners, commercial agreements, also in Europe. So I think this message was clear. Brazil wants to come back and be a respected and relevant player in the international landscape. But for sure, Brazil is a connector economy. with strong relationships to China and USA, besides emerging countries, and with Brazil as the third largest direct investment received in 2022 after USA and China. The country needs to improve its infrastructure, and there have been increasing private investments in infrastructure projects, especially in railways and ports, highways and airports, through a pipeline of concessions, auctions and regulatory reforms. Many are happening already. So we talk a lot about custo Brasil, the Brazil cost, which makes it hard to do successful business, not only for the big multinationals, but also for the startups. And we're talking about cost of fiscal complexity, labor relations, trade, tariffs, bad infrastructure, bureaucracy in general, etc. The cost of Brazil maybe was a smaller problem in the past when Brazil was more closed. You were competing in Brazil with Brazil. But in today's global business landscape, it has been clear that Brazil has lost productivity and competitiveness. So, but both private and public sectors are very much aware of it today, and reforms are on their way. Two important reforms were passed recently, the pension reform and the labor reform. And right now, we're discussing a fiscal reform in Congress and the Senate, which will pass. So with all those reforms up and running, we are sure that Brazil will be a more relevant player in the global market. I think it's also important to mention that Brazil has become very interesting for international investors because of the green energy. Brazil is today accounts for almost 7% of the whole planet's renewable energy production, and of its own energy, 93% is from clean sources in Brazil. So here we see a big international interest to be able to produce sustainable manner. The agriculture business in Brazil is also very modern and efficient, and it's really mind-boggling to see the numbers, how much the country produces in terms of soy, sugar, fruits, meat. So, I mean, the whole world, it's in the whole world's interest that Brazil continues to grow and develop using sustainable and responsible politics, both nationally and internationally. And to finish, I think it's important to see what the companies say, what they show. And I think, and it's a fact that none of the Swedish big companies in Brazil are planning to leave. On the contrary, many are investing, big investments are happening, and new companies coming in. One very positive example is H&M, which have decided to come to Brazil, and the first stores will be opened in 2025. So, summing up, lots of challenges, ups and downs, but I think both, it's a good moment for Brazil.
Thank you, Jonas. Let's move on to Daniela. Restructuring supply chains that have been developed over the past few decades is, of course, difficult. If you're a Swedish company, you likely have reliance on production in, for example, China. Trade with China has been strong over the past few years and, let's face it, profitable for both actors. But how is the situation now? How has Swedish investments in China changed according to your observations?
Yes, so actually it's true that in China, for China has never been so relevant as it is now for many companies. So they tend to, for example, not do friendshoring or nearshoring, but keep most of their supply chains in China for China, and even moving some supply chains to China from elsewhere. But of course, that this means also for these companies who used to export from China, there is a trend now that that is changing. They're changing their supply chain to be producing more closer to those markets where they export to. So, for example, US, they would probably supply directly from the US for those products. So there is definitely a shift, and also in order not to be dependent actually on the geopolitics, including sanctions, etc. But the Chinese government have actually put in place quite recently several policies also to increase the foreign investment. This is something they would like to see increase, especially within manufacturing and also sustainability. So there are opportunities there as well. But what is important, again, coming back to the China speed and the local competition, this is actually the main concern for companies here in the Swedish, or foreign companies, I would say, even here in China, operating here, as the Chinese competitors are actually now doing products that are good to great quality for lower price. And this is a huge development from how it used to be, where quality was a unique selling point actually for Swedish companies. And that would also justify the higher price. But this is not the case anymore. So M&A is one way that companies are tackling this increasing challenge. So they will buy their Chinese competitors. And of course, to tackle this challenge is also important to invest in the market in order to keep up to the speed and innovation we have here in China. And as the MNCs are seeing China as one of their most important markets and have no intentions, as I mentioned before, to leave the market anytime soon. But we do see small and medium-sized companies leaving the market, but of course also new ones are entering. But another big challenge actually for the companies here in China is the increasingly complicated regulatory systems on the market. And this is therefore, it's extremely important for them to get the right advice and also help on the market in order to be compliant. So this is also something they need to make sure to invest in, this kind of market intelligence. We also see many delegations now from headquarters finally coming to China after over 3 years to meet with their subsidiaries and their management here in China. And this is, of course, elementary for investments to the market to come back and actually grow, as we have seen quite a setback in that during the COVID times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And lastly, I will trouble you with probably the hardest question to pose on a webinar like this. Sorry in advance, but using your expertise and your observations, Mikael, how will this business landscape look in the coming 5 to 10 years?
Yes, wow, that is a hard question, but I would say that it will certainly be a more data-driven and digital economy. I think that's a trend which is unstoppable. We will see what's now driving globalization is really data flows, and our economies are transforming into a more digital environment all over the board. It will also be a more decarbonized economy for sure, which is a really positive trend. I think that's an unstoppable trend as well. The good side with all the new subsidies is that they tend to go a lot into the green, to be green investments and go into green technology, which is a good thing with them. Even the IRA package in US, even though we don't much like it in Europe, it is accelerating clean investments. So digitalized, decarbonized, but unfortunately at the same time, it will be an economy that is also a bit more weaponized, securitized, and balkanized. So splintering of the broad global economic networks into more regionally spread networks that are to some extent de-risked or even decoupled from each other. I think that's the broad picture where we will end up in 5 to 10 years' time.
Yes, and that answer will be the final remark of this webinar. So nice to see that we can all make these kinds of webinars happen to show our interest in geopolitics, international economy, and international trade. On behalf of Stockholm Chamber of Commerce and the Swedish Chambers International, me and Luis would like to thank our keynote speaker Mikael, and of course our colleagues Jonas, Daniela, and Sara for their valuable inputs on the changing global business landscape. And we would also like to thank you, our viewers, for attending this webinar. Please sign up to our newsletter to see our future events and follow us on social media. Links are in the description of this webinar. Thank you.